Stars
Podcast. This is the
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
You know it's all about that boom here on the Five Starr Wrestling Report podcast. Welcome to the show, new and returning viewers. We are here each Monday and Friday to bring you recaps and news discussions on a wide range of wrestling topics. You got AEW Dynamite, Rampage, NWA Power, weekend events and pay-per-views, news bulletins, and of course our retro review series for each Friday edition. Again, currently we are in the process of talking about NWA World Championship Wrestling from 1986 and World Class Championship Wrestling from 1983. And as always, if you are checking out the show each week, make sure you subscribe, comment, and like the show for me. I would appreciate all the support I can get from everyone here on YouTube. We are also on Rumble, so make sure you check the description for the link if you would prefer to watch the show on that platform. Of course, as per usual with the Friday show, we've got the standard AEW Dynamite report to run down, as well as a continuation of our retro review series. And as always, we will knock out the Dynamite report first, since that is obviously what everyone comes to hear and see. Gotta give the people what they want. And again, for those keeping score at home, this would be the January 12th edition of AEW Dynamite, the second week here on the TBS station. Show begins with the Undisputed Era coming out for a promo. Yeah, go figure. AEW actually bothering to change up the format for once and start with something other than a professional wrestling match for a change. Although by the end of this, I probably would have preferred that they had opened with a match instead. Or just cut this from the show entirely. Anyway, so Adam Cole's out there putting over the fact that he's undefeated in singles competition, puts over Red Dragon as the best tag team in the business today, and most of the initial stuff here was good. And as soon as the Beta Bucks and Cutler came out, this segment immediately went on a downward plummet. First of all, I know it's kind of their gimmick, so this isn't exactly groundbreaking news, but the Bucks look absolutely ridiculous. Everything about them, from their god-awful middle school acting to their promos, their effeminate attire, their goofy, awkward mannerisms on camera, they're so bad, dude. And like, obviously, if their ring style is your thing, I guess I can understand where people see the charm in them. But, I mean, God, even the most diehard of the diehard Young Bucks and AEW fans have to acknowledge just how unbearably horrible the Bucks are at doing anything resembling promos on this show. Yet, for some reason, we seem to get more and more of it with each passing week, and it never gets any better the more they do it. But the whole deal here was that the Bucks and Red Dragon were getting into a verbal back and forth over who's the better tag team. As if it takes a fucking rocket scientist to figure that one out in 5 seconds. And of course, the deal is Adam Cole is trying to play peacemaker between the two groups because everyone's not on the same page. There's a classic Russo trope right there. Partners and teammates that can't get along. Actually saw more than one example of that on this particular show. And as if the Bucks couldn't have made things any worse by getting involved here, out come Orange Cassidy and the Goon Squad. And long story short, Cassidy gives Cole the double takedown. Everyone gets into a proverbial chaotic brawl where guys are doing the most fake-looking punching you've ever seen. There was a split second in this segment where I actually thought that Chris Statler and Adam Cole were actually going to come to blows. More than likely because there really wasn't a doubt in my mind that Statlander could have actually been able to take Adam Cole in a legit fight. But of course, they shot that angle so that Britt Baker could run out to take out Statlander instead. All of this to set up what, you might ask? A mixed tag match for next week's show with Adam Cole and Britt Baker going up against Orange Cassidy and Chris Statlander. Yeah. The first ever long-awaited mixed tag team pairing of Adam Cole and Britt Baker. And their first match as a couple on this show is being wasted in a fucking Orange Cassidy match. The biggest collective waste of human plasma they have on their entire roster. So I'm sure that match will suck hard cock because Cassidy's involved, but I guess we'll see how things pan out next week. So following that completely pointless WWE light opening brawl, we get Wardlow versus CM Punk. And I remember I joked last week about how going into this match, one of two things were bound to happen. Either Wardlow was beating CM Punk and handing him his first singles loss on free TV, or Punk was going to beat Wardlow and he was going to thwart the momentum of Wardlow's monster push that they've been putting him on with, what did they say, a double-digit match winning streak or something? So, figuring that someone was going to have to do a job here, I kind of went in expecting things to not turn out for the better, but I went in with an open mind just to see how they went about booking it and, find out if they can manage to protect both guys by the end of it. And after watching how things panned out, I will credit them for trying. But at the end of the day, the finish was still incredibly stupid. The match was pretty much an extended heat beatdown with Wardlow whipping Punk from pillar to post. Punk had made an initial brief comeback after the break by hitting the running knee in the corner to Wardlow, and after he started jaw-jacking with MJF on the outside, Wardlow snatched Punk up from out of the corner and began the Powerbomb Symphony. And by the way, I wanted to point this out too. The video pre-tape with Wardlow smashing dudes while they were playing Beethoven's Fifth, it's fucking awesome. And the match ended up turning into Wardlow going through his series of powerbombs to Punk, but MJF kept telling him to do more. And I will note, there was one incredibly stupid part in this whole thing, and that was the part where Wardlow went to try and pin Punk after the first series of powerbombs, and while Aubrey was in the middle of counting the fall, MJF got on the apron and told her to stop, and then Aubrey just stopped counting. I was like, what in the fuck was that? When has that ever been done in the history of the business where a ref is in the middle of counting a fall, and because someone yelled for them to stop counting, they just cooperatively stop? No one's ever thought that in the history of the business up until this point. So aside from that major dud of an angle, the Powerbomb series continued. Kind of started to drag a little bit by the end there, but we get the finish. And again, I get what they were trying to do, but in execution, I still don't think it worked. What happens is Wardlow ends up powerbombing Punk through a table on the outside, and I actually thought at first, oh, okay, I see what they're going to do. So Aubrey's going to call for the medical team. Match will end up getting thrown out as like a no contest or whatever. Neither guy will have to do a job, and they keep Wardlow strong. They protect Punk's record. All things come to a good closure. Well, that's not what happened. What happened was Punk beat the 10 count back to the ring, which, by the way, even JR noted how slow and ridiculous Aubrey's 10 count was, and I know I've been on her case for doing that before. And after Punk rolls back in, Wardlow tries to pick Punk up again. MJF gets on the apron again, and then Punk just small package flash pins Wardlow and beats him clean. And, yeah, that really didn't come off well on television. Which really begs the ultimate question after the fact. Why book this match in the first place? Like, especially when MJF comes out later in the program to announce that next week it's going to be Punk versus Shawn Spears. Like, I mean, I can get behind the idea of having Punk run the gauntlet of the Pinnacle group before he gets to MJF. Like, maybe with Wardlow being the last stop, but like, to start with Wardlow and then work backwards to Spears, just why? Like I said, I get what they were going for. Like, they had a clever idea on paper, but when the end result is Wardlow getting pinned clean after they've been spending weeks building him up with dominant TV wins, it just felt like more retracting with his character than anything. I maybe could have bought the finish here if Wardlow hadn't already suffered a handful of defeats throughout his AEW career thus far anyway. Like, if both guys went into the match undefeated and, Punk beat Wardlow clean and then added like a first blemish to his win-loss record, that would have been fine. But we've already seen Wardlow do a handful of jobs in AEW. So when this was over, it just felt like they were needlessly throwing a roadblock in front of his monster push. Now, I will say, the stuff afterwards with MJF getting snarly with Wardlow, they did the big tease with Wardlow turning on MJF by grabbing his wrist. I mean, the crowd got behind it. I mean, you could definitely tell there's an urge to see that split when it eventually happens, so that was good. I just wasn't sold on Wardlow taking the L when it really wasn't called for. So, up next we had Powerhouse Hobbs versus Dante Martin. And if you are already not sick of the story of the heel beating down the babyface from start to finish until the flash pin at the end, well, you can pretty much copy and paste everything about the layout of the Wardlow Punk match and put it here. Literally, there was virtually no difference with how the match was laid out. Hobbs beat on Dante forever. Dante made a little comeback at the end. Hobbs cut him off momentarily. And finally, after Ricky Starks kept interfering on the outside, this led to Jay Lethal, of all people, running out for the save. And that distraction allowed for Dante to hit the moonsault dive onto Hobbs for the pin out of nowhere. So yeah, Hobbs lost again, which seems to be the story of Powerhouse Hobbs in AEW. The dude barely ever works, and when he does, he always loses. And as far as the whole Jay Lethal Dante Martin alliance, your guess is as good as mine. I mean, Dante Martin has been through more tag partners and alliances than pickup artists go through women. And while there's a part of me that would like to be excited about them actually doing something constructive with Jay Lethal, after pretty much doing nothing of substance since he showed up, I wouldn't say aligning with Dante Martin is something that I am licking my chops to see. But again, I guess we will see how things turn out. We had more Inner Circle Eddie Kingston drama backstage, which I mostly glanced over in passing. This also may have been the worst promo that Jericho has ever cut in AEW. Dude literally couldn't stop stumbling over himself here. And they also pretty much told us Jericho and Kingston are going to be ringside for the main event, so expect outside shenanigans and bullshit to occur. Because again, in AEW, you can never just have a straight wrestling match where we don't have to have tons of outside interference and chaotic crap going on. What was next? We had more hideous acting with the Undisputed Era and the Beta Bucks backstage. Super cringe, unfunny comedy. And unfortunately, now they've got Britt Baker associated with the Elite bullshit. So I take it will not be too long from now before they kill Britt Baker and make her another unbearable character to watch every week on TV. So buried in the middle of the show, we had Hangman Adam Page come out for a promo. And it would be one thing to have a standard generic Adam Page promo in the middle of the show in and of itself, but then you realize that Adam Page is the world champion of the company. Yes, the world champion of AEW. The alleged top guy, unceremoniously buried in the middle of the program to do a promo segment. So, Page is on a new mission statement to find his next opponent now that he has beaten Danielson. This leads to Dan Lambert coming out to interrupt, with Page delivering the best line of the entire show where he nonchalantly goes, "God shoot me." That was actually funny. Well, the short summary of the deal was that Lambert spent a few minutes putting over Page's great ring work, but basically called him out for putting on a facade of his cowboy gimmick. And yes, they actually use the word gimmick here. So this all eventually leads to Lance Archer making his big return after having been out from landing on his head after a botched moonsault on television. And the swerve here was him trapping Lambert in the ring, teasing that he was going to lay him out, and then Archer turned and clocked Page instead, gave him the blackout onto a folding chair, and all of a sudden Page has found himself an interim challenger. I don't know where Lance Archer ranks right now in the top 10, but, I mean, does anyone actually follow the ranking system and thinks it means anything worth a shit? Whatever. Yeah, it's like I said, man, you got 628 guys under contract right now. Guess you got to use everybody somehow. And to be fair, I don't actually hate the idea of a short-term Page Archer program. I do think it's funny that Archer's big return to the show, he's being put in a title program that he's evidently going to lose in, but whatever. It's not like half these guys are over anyway. We had Hikaru Shida versus Serena Deeb in our fourth rematch. You know, because AEW doesn't do rematches, right? And this is more of an extended angle than it was an actual match. Deeb jumps Shida before the bell, drives her knee into the steps, beats her down for a minute or two, and forces a ref stoppage with the single leg crab. So I'm sure this will lead to the fifth encounter, where hopefully they'll at least try to spice things up a bit by maybe tacking on some kind of gimmick to the match. Yeah, isn't that funny? The one time AEW books a program that probably would have called for a gimmick by this point, they don't do it. But by God, every other week on this show, guys are doing street fights and false count anywhere, anything goes, bloodbath fuckfest sessions when they're never called for. Again, though, I've said it before, Serena Deeb's great. Sheeta's been pretty solid lately with her work. They're two girls that know what they're doing, so I mean, with the way this current division is right now, I'll take as many of these matches as I can get. At this point, we got the lowest point of the program. It is Matt Hardy versus Penta El Ceramiedo. Guess they needed a piss break spot somewhere in the show. Of course, the match begins with the only thing Penta knows how to do. He stands in the ring and does his stupid Ceramiedo shtick while the other guy stands across from him like a complete idiot. And looking back in hindsight, the Penta-Hardy standoff in the opening minutes was probably the only redeeming thing about it, because then they started wrestling. And you want to talk about two clashing styles that should never be paired together? Here's a textbook example of that. Matt Hardy is in his mid-40s. He got visibly blown up as the match went along, and Pentagon sucks and couldn't wrestle a clean match to save his life. It got sloppier and sloppier as it went along, and after Hardy missed the moonsault off the top rope, Penta hit the package pile driver for the 3. Yes, Matt Hardy losing clean in his hometown in front of his wife and kids ringside. There's a classic WWE trope. But the afterbirth is what most people took interest in, so we will focus more on the details of that. We had Malachi Black show up to attack Alex Abrahantes and Pentagon in the ring. And I should note that when Malachi showed up and laid out Alex, Pentagon literally just stood there next to him like a complete fucking buffoon while his manager got laid out. Again, because Penta sucks and he's totally inept at everything he does in this business. And that, of course, led to the Varsity Blondes coming out to help out Penta. Griff Garrison, who was also sporting Julia Hart's skin-tight jeans for this beatdown. That was quite the visual. And while the babyfaces are at the 3-on-1 advantage beatdown on the heel, always makes for great TV when the good guys are kicking the bad guys' ass with the upper hand. This all leads to Brody King making his debut and laying out all the babyfaces by himself. And, well, I'll start with this. I don't think the Brody debut was all that surprising. I think most people were expecting this to happen last week before Ray Phoenix decided to go full Sid Vicious mode and dislocate his arm in broad daylight. And I will be fair and impartial because I do not want to immediately jump to conclusions. I have seen a little of Brody King's work in Ring of Honor. I would not say that I was ever the biggest fan of his, but he's got a unique look. And while the idea of him and Malachi Black as a team isn't exactly the most enticing thing to me, I will see what they do before I share any further thoughts. I'm sure I will evidently hate it, because that's typically the case with a lot of stuff that happens in AEW, but we will see. We had more hideous acting with some of the girls backstage to set up a Rampage match. There was a Bear Country Acclaimed match that I really didn't pay all that much attention to. All I know is that the Acclaimed won, and apparently they are the top-ranked tag team in AEW at the moment. So why the Jurassic Express are wrestling Alex Reynolds and John Silver on Friday for the belts, I couldn't tell you. We had Pac performing some demonic witchcraft. He also apparently has crafted the ability to change mood lighting. Ominous. And our main event for the show is Sammy Guevara and Daniel Garcia for the TNT Championship. And by the way, I want to note this. They announced on the show that Cody Rhodes is returning to Dynamite next Wednesday. So let me get this straight. Cody Rhodes was gone from television for approximately 2 weeks. And this 2-week absence from television left the company with no other choice but to crown an interim TNT champion, who just so happens to conveniently be the guy that Cody beat for the belt at the end of 2021. And apparently, Sammy has fulfilled his role as interim TNT champion because Cody is going to be back on TV next week anyway. Something tells me this was a conspicuously constructed storyline. By the way, did they ever actually tell us why Cody was left off of TV? I know they kept saying it was for medical reasons, but did they ever officially state what those medical reasons were? Was it actually COVID related? Was it injury related? I mean, I guess the 2-week thing would coincide with quarantining, so I guess I could buy the idea that it was COVID related, but God, who even knows anymore with Cody? So anyway, we get this match. And I will say this. Going in, I really didn't know what to expect. I've been a fan of a lot of Garcia's work in AEW, especially his single stuff. And by the way, I can't believe Garcia's only been doing this for 4 years, man. He's way too good for the amount of time he's been in the business. I mean, he's not perfect. He's a little rough around the edges still, but I mean, there's something there with him. And this is coming from me, who almost has nothing good to say about the majority of these talents that AEW has signed. Sammy Guevara, for me, he's always been very hit and miss. Some of his stuff I thoroughly enjoy. Other times it feels like I'm watching a PWG Spotfest session, so he's still a little flaky. I was cautiously optimistic going in, slightly skeptical given the size and height comparisons between the two guys here. I was kind of worried it would end up breaking down into one of those no-cell gymnastic stunt show extravaganzas. And they didn't do that. They worked a very mat-based technical match. They didn't get overly ridiculous with anything offensively. A couple sloppy spots here and there, but generally, I would say they tried to work from a more stiff shoot style. And like I said, man, I'm really high on this Garcia guy. I've been less impressed with him doing the multi-man matches where he doesn't get to shine, but virtually every time I see this guy in singles competition, he looks really good. Everything he does looks crisp. His transitions are well placed. His pacing is really solid. He sells well. He's got a lot of upside. And especially with how young and new he is to the business, I think he could be a breakout star for them someday if they don't fuck him up, which with AEW, I'm not giving my hopes up. The finish was kind of botched with Guevara hitting the GTH on Garcia, but, it is what it is. And while I was not crazy about the 2.0 stuff at the end, taking the focus off the match momentarily, at least it didn't overstay its welcome. And it did at least play into the finish. And, of course, Jericho's out there to make himself the center of attention after the fact with taking out 2.0 and getting into the shoving match with Kingston. Again, a program that I have literally no interest in seeing, but what can you do? Anything to further kill any momentum that Kingston may have initially gained from that Punk program, right? So, oh man, what can you say about it overall? This is not a bad show. It was very Heat-centric, but there was a lot less stupidity than normal here. Most of my complaints about the show were mostly chalked up to lame or bad finishes. Clearly, whatever steamer momentum this show had leading into that Full Gear pay-per-view has been completely cooled off by now. And, they're still far enough out from the Revolution pay-per-view in March where you could tell there's still a decent amount of filler material on this show right now. So, hopefully things pick up as we edge closer to the pay-per-view, but I will at least credit them for this. Compared to the last few shows I've seen from them, this was far from the worst. So, moving on to the retro portion of the Friday podcast. That brings us to the January 11th, 1986 edition of World Class Championship Wrestling. And we begin our program with Tony and David at the booth informing everyone that Arn Anderson had won the TV Championship tournament, which I believe was hosted the week prior. And we did get screen caps later on in the program during the Bill Apter scouting report where they showed some brief highlights of the matches, but that was pretty much the extent of the follow-up there, which was kind of strange considering that they actually kind of went out of their way at the tail end of 85 to really emphasize the importance of the tournament. And they also informed us as to the severity of Ole Anderson's injury at the hands of Dusty Rhodes. We were told that it is entirely possible that he may never wrestle again, which, well, if you know your NWA history, you know that was not true in the slightest. But, boy, you could tell that David Crockett would have loved for that to be the case with the way he sold that news. And that was followed with Ronnie Garvin doing a brief interview at the booth where I am not entirely sure of what he said, but I think he was getting at the point that somewhere he had read that the NWA had grossed $27 million in the previous fiscal year, and while Garvin knows that he's far from making a six-figure income in the NWA, he knows that the NWA World Heavyweight Championship guarantees him a $500,000 payout, so his goal in 1986 is to beat Flair for the title and make bank. And boy, you want to talk about a period in wrestling history where belts actually meant anything worth a damn. Take a look at Ronnie Garvin in this promo. Imagine hearing a promo in 2022 where guys are talking about the importance of being world champion because it guarantees them 5 to 6 figure income payouts. Christ, try and imagine Vince Russo coming up with a concept like this for a scripted promo segment. I don't even think that would be in the ballpark of a Russo idea for a promo segment on championships. Now, knowing a guy like Russo, he'd be sitting there stewing up an idea of how a belt could be thrown into a trash can and set on fire on live national television. Because ratings. Anyway, our opening match is Ivan and Nikita Kolov taking on the Italian Stallion and Rocky King. And while I did not write much down about the match itself, I did want to briefly point this out. So I watched a lot of WCW during the Nitro era in the mid to late 90s. And obviously, for those of you that may have forgotten, one of WCW's main officials during that period, alongside sleazeball Nick Patrick, was good old Pee Wee Randy Anderson. And something I always remember hearing Bobby Heenan and Tony Schiavone constantly refer to him as Pee Wee Anderson around that point. To which I would always respond with, what is so Pee Wee-esque about Randy Anderson in 1997 or 1998? Like, he was not small or tiny, both from a height sense and a body mass sense. He was a relatively shorter, plump guy. And then I saw Randy Anderson officiating wrestling in the year 1986. I now know why he was referred to as Pee Wee Anderson. In 1986, Randy was indeed very small, very frail, very rail thin, not a lot of body mass at all. By the year 1997, he ballooned. But in 1986, he was probably no heavier than 130 pounds. And trust me, I am a very skinny, rail-thin dude myself, so when I notice how small and skinny someone is, you can safely presume that I am not exaggerating that. But aside from analyzing Randy Anderson's stick-like stature, there really wasn't anything notable about this. We did have another precariously close visual of Nikita grabbing a handful of Rocky's nether regions during the pin, which is always classic. Then we get the post-match promo with the Kolovs, where we had the usual hilarity of Crusher Khrushchev not even attempting a Russian accent. All the while, Nikita's promo is so incomprehensible, literally the only thing I could audibly understand him utter is the name Magnum TA.
He's a Magnum TA! How do you call? I hear a freedom rider! What is time, Magnum TA? You come to your knees and meet Nikita Kolov. You see, Nikita is time going to take you title and the wrong way. Nikita here, how you also have maybe little problem. What happened to you also?
Russian team led by...
I will pay anyone $50 to transcribe that entire promo verbatim and leave it posted in the comments section. We had Tully Blanchard versus Mac Jeffers. I believe, actually, I'd have to refer to my notes from last week, but I remember one of the Jeffers brothers got massacred and killed by Ronnie Garvin on last week's show. But considering that both of them competed this week on television, I assume whichever brother it was that got pummeled by Ronnie Garvin was okay after the fact. This was slightly less of a Jeffers Brothers massacre. Tully, of course, wins with the slingshot suplex, which, now, to be fair, Mac Jeffers isn't a big guy per se. He's certainly not Sam Houston, though, so watching Tully hoist up bigger guys off the mat for those slingshot suplexes never gets old. I also appreciated David Crockett drawing attention to the fact that J.J. Dillon is now sporting the three-piece suit, as opposed to whatever in the hell that getup was he was wearing when he was managing Buddy Landell in '85. Following that, we had Arn at the booth for a quick promo, mostly just to put over being the television champion and the fact that he was going to be a defending champion, which, spoiler alert for those watching, but he wasn't lying about that. And keep in mind, Arn is a heel on this program. But by golly, he's going to be a fighting champion and give people opportunities because he is a quality, upstanding man. He also informed us that Ole will be back within the 30-day window for him and Arn to defend the National Tag Team Championships. More to come on that. We had the Barbarians squashing Art Pritz in a few minutes. Art Pritz, which might be the dumbest ring name I think I've heard since Braun Breaker. And most of this was just Tony and David plunging the fans sending in their postcards to select their NWA Dream Match. Yes, postcard plugs in the year 1986. Times have very much changed in the last 30 or so years. And actually, off the top of my head, I don't remember what came of the whole Dream Match fans' choice idea. Maybe they blew it off as like a one-and-done thing, but the main point here was that the NWA was only accepting postcards, and in order for the fans' matches to be considered, everyone had to label their postcard Dream Match. I guess to prevent obligatory spam or the asshats that would have sent porn images to the NWA mailing address. I mean, you never know. People were stupid. Magnum TA wrestled Thunderfoot. This was not, in fact, a simple in-and-out procedure for Magnum this week. No, he actually wrestled Thunderfoot here for a few minutes before putting him away with the belly-to-belly. Perhaps after running a 20-minute Broadway marathon with Ole on TV a short while back, Magnum figured, well, I can actually do more stuff than a simple belly-to-belly throw. Let's do some chain wrestling for a minute or two, and then I'll slap on my belly-to-belly. And there was more to come with our United States Heavyweight Champion later in the program. Up next, we had what David Crockett joyously referred to as the Pistol Man, Pez Whatley, against George South. This was highly less amusing than Pez's post-match promo. All I will say about the match is that it was merely boring. I think I fell asleep twice in about a 5-minute time span. And when it was all said and done, I think I came to the understanding with why they turned this man heel later in the year. Now, the promo Pez did afterwards, where he was a fired, jacked-up babyface, just throwing his name into the hat for title contention in 1986, letting everyone know that this was going to be the year of the pistol. It was a passionate promo, it was full of vigor and full of fire, and yet I have never heard a man speak so passionately and lively, yet pretty much get 0 point across aside from the fact that he's here to fight. Still better than scripted material, I'll give it that. It was not as good as Dusty Rhodes' promo with Baby Doll at the booth, where, I'm not kidding here, the entire premise of his promo was him trying to backpedal for essentially calling Baby Doll a skank less than 3 weeks ago. Because again, for those of you that are trying to follow along in the timeline here, the story basically goes something like this. Baby Doll was a heel on this program throughout pretty much all of 1985, and she was synced up with Tully Blanchard. And as the year came to closure, J.J. Dillon had split from Buddy Landau, who had unceremoniously been let go from the company. Dillon proceeds to link up with the Horsemen, which means that Baby Doll was pretty much of no use to Tully's side piece. So she turned babyface from virtually out of nowhere, which meant that Dusty had to take back every horrible thing he had ever said about Baby Doll less than a month ago, when she was a heel, because now Baby Doll is Dusty's side piece. Pro wrestling, everyone. Isn't it great? And of course, Baby Doll sells it perfectly by just standing there smiling, probably having no idea what the fuck Dusty's even talking about. Somehow Dusty got onto a tangent about how white people have no rhythm. And as a musician and drummer growing up playing music in a Christian denomination surrounded by white non-musicians trying to replicate gospel music on a week-in, week-out basis, I can confirm that what Dusty said is true. You also know you're in one hell of a downward spiral when people begin clapping on beats 1 and 3. Bad times. Following that, we had the Rock and Roll Express taking on Randy Mulkey and Vernon Deaton. Randy Mulkey, who I honestly can't even put it into words. He looks like Owen Wilson with a mop head haircut. Match was nothing, but boy did I have a thing or two to say about that promo that the Rock and Roll did later on. J.J. Dillon and Tully were at the booth to sort of recap their mission statement to take out all of Dusty's friends in order to get to him at the end. And they showed some house show footage with totally jumping Jimmy Valiant during a match with Black Bart and giving the pile driver on the cement floor, which in the year 1986 I totally could have bought as a devastating heat angle. In 2022, I would merely view it as a transition spot to go to a commercial break where when they come back from the break, the guy that took the initial pile driver would be no-selling it. Because modern wrestling sucks. Ronnie Garvin versus Paul Garner. Not quite the brutal beatdown I would have expected Ronnie to give a jobber on this program. Perhaps Ronnie may have just had some heat with one of the Jeffers brothers last time, and that's why he stiffed him so badly in that match. This was more so Ronnie doing some boring wrestling for a few minutes, doing some chest slaps, and then giving Garner the knockout punch, to which afterwards he paintbrush slaps him on the mat afterwards. So, no casualties with this one. So back at the booth with the Rock and Roll Express, speaking of near casualties, we were unceremoniously graced with a Robert Gibson promo. And when I say Robert Gibson cut a promo, I do not mean that he just threw in his usual 2 lines and then they passed the mic to Ricky Morton to save it. They gave Gibson the stick, and he talked, and he talked, and he talked, and he talked, and with each passing minute, you could just watch his eyes glaze over as he kept trying desperately not to lose his train of thought. He's realizing that the tides are coming in, and he's about to get wiped out if he doesn't wrap this shit up as concisely and as quickly as possible. Luckily, I would merely say that this was bad, although the last 10 seconds were some pretty wretched television. And I love Robert Gibson, everyone. Don't get me wrong, but I've talked about this before on the program. When it came to rock and roll promos, there was always one universal truth when it came to these guys on promo time. The less Robert spoke, the better. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, well, why exactly did Robert do all the talking if he wasn't a good promo? Well, the answer, you see, they had shot an angle where the Midnight Express had attacked the Rock and Roll Express during a match, and during that attack, Jim Cornette and the Midnight Express had struck Ricky Morton throat first with a tennis racket, thus injuring his windpipe and preventing him from speaking. Now you probably might be wondering, well, why didn't they just do this exact same angle but do it with Robert Gibson, who we've already established is better being a mute anyway and not doing long-winded promos? To which I would answer that your guess is as good as mine. I have no idea why they decided that Ricky Morton, the guy who can actually cut a promo, they decided that he should be the one to get his throat severely damaged to prevent him from talking, but whatever. This was then followed by a semi-ratchy voiced Jim Cornette doing a promo, making a mockery of the whole rock and roll injury angle. And again, this is the point where they showed the clip in full to clue everyone in on what went down. I also appreciated Jim Cornette taking the time to point out that the Rock and Roll had won this house show tag match via illegal double drop kick, because this was at a time when heels actually knew how to be good heels. And aside from hyping up his men for the next match, the only other thing I wrote down here is that this was easily the most ridiculous getup we've seen Cornette in on this program thus far. A black shirt with a yellow tie with a green blazer with red dress pants. You could not have asked for a more mismatched attire here, and Cornette pulled it off perfectly. So following that, we had the Midnight Express in action against Team Bill, as my notes read here.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill.
And aside from the usual great antics we get from Cornette jabbing with the announcers, it was a pretty paint-by-numbers Midnight Express squash. Nothing really to note about anything that happened. At this point in the program, we had our first of, I guess, what became a stable piece for the NWA Superstation programming in '86. It was our first scouting report session with Bill Apter, and his special guest for the week was Magnum TA. And I'm trying to come up with the best way to kind of summarize what this was. They basically shot the shit for about 15 minutes on various topics. It was very Sports Insider. They tried to present it like something you would see on regular Sports Center stations or ESPN, what have you. And I'll say this before I get into details about it. It was very long, but I didn't hate it. Up until this point with reviewing the show, the formula has been pretty lather, rinse, repeat. We open the show with Tony and Crockett at the booth to plug the matches. We go to the ring for a match. We get an interview. Then we go back to the ring for a match. Back to the booth for an interview. Then we go back to the ring for another match. And then back for another interview. And after seeing that same formula for 7 or 8 shows in a row, I can appreciate the attempt to break up the flow and the monotony of the programming. And I think Magnum was a great first host for this particular session. Because, especially in the year 1986, pro wrestling still had a lot of wacky, over-the-top characters and personas. If they'd have tried this first test run with like a Jimmy Valiant or a Barbarian or a Nikita Kolov, it would have been a complete flop. Actually, now that I think about it, I kind of would have liked to see Bill Apter try to interview the Barbarian or Nikita Kolov in one of these sit-downs. Can you imagine? But the reason this works well with Magnum is that, the entire interview was Magnum being his authentic self. Apter threw in some questions at him regarding potential opponents he's eyeballing for the U.S. Heavyweight Championship. Magnum gave some thoughts on some of the talent, put over some of the possibilities that could come out of those matches. Magnum kind of revisited the issue with the Horsemen, talked about the I Quit match with Tully, and, they have a blood feud that'll probably never be resolved as long as they're working under the same roof. The big takeaway from the interview was Apter and Magnum talking about Nikita Kolov, who definitely became a very integral part of the TV programming throughout the remainder of the year. And I will say, hearing Magnum cut the patriotic, heroic, pro-American babyface promo, talking about how Nikita is ungratefully reaping the benefits and rewards of society and how it'd be criminal to see Nikita carry the United States Heavyweight Championship when he doesn't represent the values and the morals of our country. It was great hearing a promo delivery like that. And it makes me realize that there's actually a point in my lifetime where the majority of the country wasn't split 50-50 on hating everything this country was founded on and, constantly bitching and moaning that America was founded on stolen land and America sucks, blah, blah, blah. Which, when you listen to mainstream media and that's the only perspective you get, I can understand why you'd be so blinded. That all said, the part of the sit-down where they had Ronnie Garvin answer fan mail questions, a question that asked Ronnie to run down and expand on his list of hobbies that he enjoys, that part I probably could have done without. No offense to Ronnie. Good guy, and I appreciate the fact that he enjoys manly sports like hunting and fishing and being outdoors. I can honestly say that in no uncertain terms, I really don't need to see Ronnie talk about his hobbies on a professional wrestling program. Unless I'm watching Chris D'Elia talk about his experience going deer hunting, I'm good. I will say, one thing that really hit home hard, especially if you're well aware of Magnum TA's story, when Bill asked Magnum at the beginning of the interview, what is in store for Magnum in the year 1986, my heart immediately sunk. That was a tough one to swallow. So then we had, I guess what was essentially a return match from the Starrcade pay-per-view. It's Crusher Khrushchev defending the Mid-Atlantic Heavyweight title against Sam Houston. And the best way I can sum up everything about this match is that they did about 5 or so minutes of every standard TV match you've ever seen on the show before. And by the time we got to the point where Khrushchev hit the diving clothesline from the top rope and started selling the leg, this match totally turned around for the better. What happens is the Russians start getting involved at ringside, which leads to the Road Warriors running down to get into a brawl with them. And while the ref is dealing with shenanigans around ringside, they do one of the best finishing spots I think I've ever seen in a professional wrestling match. Sam Houston gets tossed over the top rope from Khrushchev behind Pee Wee Anderson's back, and I think it was Animal that caught Houston on the throw. But Animal catches Houston in his arms. He heaves Houston back over the top rope onto Khrushchev, who stumbles down onto the mat, still selling the bad knee. And as Anderson comes over to count his shoulders to the mat, Animal grabs a hold of Khrushchev's ankle. He fucks over the Russians, and Sam Houston, who, mind you, just won the Mid-Atlantic Heavyweight title, may as well have been selling it like it was the WrestleMania main event finish with the way the people were reacting to this. And mind you, I should also point this out. When I say that Animal caught Houston and heaved him back over the top rope onto Khrushchev, I do not mean that Animal caught him while standing on the ring apron. Animal caught Houston in his arms from outside the ring with all his might and strength. He power pressed Houston back over the top rope. Not the middle rope, the top rope. And then Houston fell onto Khrushchev, who collapsed onto the ground. And Sam Houston, for those of you that don't know, I mean, he's not huge, but he's also not Rey Mysterio size. He was still probably a good 6 feet, maybe 220 to 225. An Animal muscled this guy from outside, threw him back into the ring, over the top rope for this finishing spot, and it was perfectly executed. And of course, we got the post-match brawl with all the baby faces running out afterwards. A perfect match with a perfect post-match angle, all leading to a commercial break. Because we had more to come. We had Arn Anderson defending the newly won TV title against Jim Jeffers. Yeah, that was the main event for the program. I will say that this was not as captivating as the Mid-Atlantic Heavyweight title match. You'll be shocked to learn that Jim fucking Jeffers was not really a top-notch quality match for Arn Anderson here, but by God, he tried. And after Arn won, Dusty got in the ring and challenged Arn to come fight him, but Arn turned his back and claimed that this was not the appropriate time to do it. Yes, Arn and Dusty coming to blows in the middle of a professional wrestling ring on live TV. It doesn't cut the mustard. There's got to be a better location to host a fighting session between these two guys with beef. What the hell's a professional wrestling ring going to do? What are they going to do? Irish whips? Good call, Arn. Smart man. I will say that overall, I actually enjoyed the show a lot more than I probably should have. The storyline material was much more emphasized on last week's show, especially with all the Horseman stuff. But there was some fine follow-up this week. The only thing I would say that sucked on the show was Robert Gibson trying to cut a 2-minute nonstop promo. That came off like a nice wet fart. But other than that, this is good. Even the scouting report stuff was great. Maybe discounting Ronnie Garvin talking about ways he likes to spend his free time. But, yeah, quality show. Still better than Dynamite. That's for damn sure. And that brings us to this edition of World Class Championship Wrestling from January 15th, 1983. I will admit out of the gate, this was not better than Dynamite. But, we'll get there. This is a very, very story-driven show, most of which centered around the fallout to the Christmas Star Wars cage match between Kerry Von Erich, Ric Flair, and the Freebirds. And actually, you probably could call this episode the Freebirds Tribute Edition because all three matches featured the group in some fashion. And, well, I'll get this out of the way first. This is not a particularly good show when it came to the wrestling aspect of things, and judging how the Freebirds were involved in all the matches, especially too when you consider the guys that took part in the main event tag, it's really saying something. So the first match is Bryan and Diaz taking on Buddy Roberts. Before that, actually, Mercer did an interview with Roberts and Hayes at ringside to basically establish that Buddy is the newest member of the Freebirds. And actually, if I'm not mistaken, I think this was one of the very first televised matches we would see with Buddy Roberts as the official member of the Freebirds group. And they had a pretty standard match. Brief flurry of offense early from a Diaz. Roberts cut him off for the heat. Of course, we had the spot with the heel using the ropes for leverage, with the ref catching him out of the corner. And the finish was the match ending in an alleged 10-minute time limit draw. Even though the match itself, I think I had calculated it went approximately 8. Kind of made sense to do the time limit draw, especially with what they were building towards for next week's show with the Diaz. Roberts was always kind of the fall guy for the Freebirds anyway, especially when they were doing six-mans and regular tag matches. Roberts would usually be the guy to take the fall, mostly because he wasn't going to get hurt doing the job. So, I get what they were going for with the booking. Following that, we had Bill Mercer conducting an interview at the Freebirds' home. And when I tell you that I couldn't understand a goddamn thing that was uttered from anyone in this entire pre-tape, due in large part to the dubbed Leonard Skinner Freebird mix, I'm not kidding about that. By the way, I should also point out, what in the hell was that Freebird remix? I know WWE's gone through a periodic change of dub tunes for some of their older shows, and I can totally understand that they probably wouldn't have gotten the rights to use the original tune, but God, that mix was atrocious. This is also some horrible post-production work, and I'm honestly kind of surprised that they didn't edit this on the Peacock to maybe lower the volume of the background music so that we could understand what the guys were saying. I mean, the main gist was both guys sharing their sides of the stories when it came to the cage match from the Christmas Star Wars show. Obviously, Mercer was trying to plead his case from the reality of how things really went down. But, the Freebirds were giving their slanted perspective, claiming that Kerry deliberately knocked Hayes out of the cage, which led to Terry slamming the cage door into Kerry's head for revenge. And things get pretty heated toward the end, to the point where the Freebirds kick Mercer out of their home so they can continue with their game of pool. Buddy Roberts, I should also point out, was just casually playing without a shirt on. That was great. And as we go back to the booth, Mercer casually drops the line, "Well, not the answers we were looking for." Not that the answers were audible anyway, but aside from my joking about the horrible production flunks with this whole thing, the story, in my opinion, is still one of the most well-constructed, well-put-together, logical pro wrestling storylines in the history of the business. Because with where we are in the timeline right now, and, after hearing both sides of the argument here, yes, while we all clearly saw that Kerry bumping Hayes out of the cage was a complete accident, you can also see things from the Freebirds' perspective, given where they were in that current moment. They never had the visual of Ric Flair running up from behind to knee Kerry in the back, which evidently led to Kerry knocking Hayes out of the cage to begin with. So, even though the Freebirds are totally in the wrong, and Gordy's actions were clearly not premeditated, the situation did make sense as to why they would react that way. The other thing I loved about it, from what I was able to make out of Hayes' promo, is that he was already on edge in that match with having David Manning, Ric Flair, and Kerry Von Erich all constantly making his job really difficult by not obeying his calls. He essentially made the claim that he was working a 3-on-1 handicap situation, and things had boiled over to the point where he just up and left the match because he just had enough of everything. And again, yes, it's irrational, but you can totally buy why Hayes would respond that way. It's one of those stories that you really can't poke many plot holes with the way everything was laid out. You can maybe find a couple loose screws here and there, but generally with the way everything was constructed, laid out, and filmed, I'm telling you, man, it still ranks up there as one of the best professional wrestling books, feuds, matches, and storylines in history. So, I mean, yay for story follow-up. Thumbs down with the poor production in the pre-tape. Next match was Almodrill versus Michael Hayes. The match probably only went like 8 or so minutes. Felt like 40. And after a pretty nothing-happening, boring match, Hayes hits Madrill with the pile driver, and it is at this point that Jose Lothario runs in for the fucked DQ finish, and I almost screamed. Yes, the sit-out pile driver was too far for Mr. Lothario on this show. And not even Hayes giving Madrill the pile driver on a chair or on the outside concrete. No, a straight pile driver in the middle of the ring. But that led to Lothario laying out the challenge to Hayes to fight him any place and any time. Had a brief plug for the upcoming main event, which consisted of David Manning and Bill Mercer running down the rules for the match. Now, we'll elaborate on this once we break down the match, and boy, do I have a thing or two to say about it, but allegedly, here's what we were told beforehand. It is a 6-man tag with a $5,000 reward for the winner. And if a guy is pinned, submitted, or thrown over the top rope, he is out of the match and he has to go back to the locker room. And is it at this point that Andre the Giant walks into the frame, which of course forced the cameraman to zoom all the way out to capture all 3 guys in the shot. Because I don't know if y'all forget this or not, but Andre the Giant was very big. And Mercer pretty much asked Andre if he feels he's at a disadvantage, considering that he's the biggest guy in the match. It's easier for him to get tossed over the top rope. And Andre gives the coolest and calmest response by going, "No way, battle royals are my thing, and I'm going to have no problem finding a way to win." And this was pretty great, I'll be honest. And Andre the Giant attempting to say the phrase "over the top rope," just classic. So that brings us to the main event 6-man tag free-for-all battle royal thing. And again, the match, I presumed going in, was David Von Erich, Bugsy McGraw, and Andre the Giant taking on King Kong Bundy, Wild Bill Irwin, and Terry Gordy. And by the time we got to the finishing sequence where Gordy eliminated his own tag partner to win the match, I had no idea what was going on here. But let's talk about the match, because far be it for me to complain about a pro wrestling match boring me to tears. This is the same guy that constantly rips on how bad the Lucha Bros and the Young Bucks matches are, because all they do in their matches are flip-floppy gymnastic stunts. But my God, man, when I tell you that this might have been one of the most lifeless, boring matches I've ever seen, I don't think that's an exaggeration. Here's what happened during this 15-minute or so match. Kerry Von Erich and Terry Gordy brawled for the first minute. Kerry got dumped out of the ring after Hayes ran in for the distraction. Bugsy gets randomly eliminated over the top rope within the first 3 minutes. And after Kerry and Bugsy are gone, the next 10 to 12 minutes consisted of Andre the Giant laying on the mat with Terry Gordy in a sleeper hold. And every couple or so minutes, Bundy and Irwin would try to break up and pry Andre off of Terry. And they would get Andre off of Terry. Andre would do a couple offensive takedowns to the heels, and then he would go right back to choking Terry. And this process repeated for well over 10 minutes. I practically shit myself, I was so bored. I left the room for about 2 minutes to heat up my coffee, and when I came back, Andre was still laying on the mat with Terry in a sleeper. I think the Earth did 5 full rotations around the sun, and Andre still had Terry in a sleeper. And we fast forward to the end, and here's where things get really wonky. After this elongated, monotonous 3-on-1 beatdown session with all the heels ganging up on Andre, Andre eventually eliminates Irwin, and as he goes to throw Terry over the top rope, Hayes basically helps him out to stop Terry from hitting the floor. This leaves Andre to chase after Hayes through the crowd, but you see, Andre is big, so he stepped out over the top rope to go after Hayes, thus eliminating himself, to which Andre was astonished that this is the case. And he's bickering with David Manning on the outside for a minute, and when we cut back to the ring, the two guys who I had thought were tag partners going in all of a sudden started fighting each other. And long story short, Gordy dumped Bundy out and won the match. And if I'm being nice, I would say that this was mind-numbingly boring. But because I'm not nice, and I had to sit through 15 minutes of this, I give this match -4 3/4 stars. -6 1/4 if it would have happened in the Tokyo Dome. Again, like I mentioned toward the beginning of the report, considering the guys involved in the TV matches this week, I kind of expected them to be better than they were. But, the main takeaway from this was them basically establishing the Freebirds as dastardly villains. And, the follow-up stuff with Kerry Von Erich trying to go right after the Freebirds in that main event, that was great. I would definitely recommend, you check out the portion of the show just to see how the character development with Hayes, Gordy, and Roberts comes along. But, if you're expecting quality wrestling this week, yeah, you ain't getting that on this show. Especially not in that main event. By God, do not watch that main event if you have any sanity. But, that'll wrap up another edition of the 5-Star Wrestling Report podcast. Again, I always appreciate the support. If y'all could subscribe, comment, and like the show for me, you'd be doing a solid. We will be back this coming Monday for the next installment of the show. Hopefully I'll have my voice back a little bit by then. I am overcoming something. God even knows what it is. And for all I know, it could have been Omicron. It's probably not Omicron. Seasonal flu or allergies. I don't know. But, yeah, hopefully this coming Monday I'll at least have a little bit of my voice back. So, sorry if this was a rough one to sit through, but did my best with this edition. Until then, take care all. Peace out.